His German shepherd wouldn't stop digging beneath the pine needles, and what the veteran uncovered made him forget the 3 suitcases he'd slept beside just days earlier. Doug froze halfway down the concrete stairs, his flashlight shaking across a steel door hidden beneath a house that wasn't supposed to exist. Boone stood in front of it, one shoulder stained with fresh blood, refusing to move. Somewhere outside, an engine growled through the trees and then went silent. Doug tightened his grip on the flashlight as cold air drifted up from below. The door was already slightly open. What do you think Boone sensed first? The last thing Douglas Mercer carried out of the house was an old canvas duffel bag that still smelled faintly of dust, machine oil, and a life nobody in that neighborhood remembered anymore. The movers had already finished. 3 suitcases sat on the sidewalk beside the curb. A faded green duffel bag rested on top of them. That was it. 37 years of marriage reduced to a pile small enough to fit into the bed of a 12-year-old pickup truck. Doug stood quietly in the cold Colorado afternoon and looked at the house, the white shutters, the maple tree he had planted when his daughter was born, the porch railing he had repaired twice after winter storms. The living room window where Christmas lights had glowed every December for almost 4 decades, someone else's house now. Across the driveway, Linda stood beside her attorney, speaking in low voices. She never looked at him, not once. The woman who had once waited for him through deployments. The woman who had written letters while he was halfway around the world. The woman who had sat beside hospital beds after surgeries. Now she stared at paperwork, as if he were already gone. Ryan stood near the garage with his arms crossed. 42 years old, successful, confident, looking more and more like his mother every year. Doug caught his son's eye. Ryan looked away first. That hurt more than the divorce. Emily at least had called earlier that morning. Her voice had sounded tired. Dad, I know this is hard. Hard. Doug almost laughed. Instead, he listened. You need to accept what's happening. Accept. Another easy word. People loved easy words. Move on. Heal. Accept. Closure. Nobody ever explained how. The front door opened. A mover carried out the final box. Photo albums. The one marked fragile. Doug recognized the handwriting. His own. The mover placed it beside the luggage. That's everything, sir. Sir. Not Doug. Not Mr. Mercer. Sir. Like a stranger. Doug nodded. Thank you. The mover gave him a look that lasted half a second too long. Pity. Doug knew the look. He had seen it in hospitals, at funerals, at military ceremonies. People never realized how visible pity was. Boone climbed down from the pickup and padded across the driveway. The German shepherd moved with a slight hitch in his back leg, an old injury. His amber eyes followed Doug everywhere, always. The dog stopped beside him and leaned gently against his knee. Solid, warm, present. Doug rested a hand on Boone's neck. The thick fur felt familiar beneath his fingers. More familiar than the house, more familiar than most people. Looks like it's just us, buddy. Boone's ears twitched. The dog glanced toward the house, then back at Doug, watching, always watching. A horn sounded down the street. Linda's attorney checked his watch. Ryan disappeared inside without another word. And just like that, 37 years ended. No dramatic speech, no apology, no explanation. Just silence. Doug loaded the suitcases himself. 1, 2, 3. The duffel bag last. His back complained when he lifted it. His right shoulder clicked the way it always had since Iraq. The same shoulder he'd landed on after an explosion outside Mosul 20 years earlier. Some injuries never really left. They just learned patience. Boone jumped into the passenger seat. Doug climbed behind the wheel. For a moment he sat there, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, looking at the front door. Nobody came outside. Nobody stopped him. Nobody changed their mind. He turned the key. The old truck started immediately. One small mercy. The house disappeared in the rearview mirror. Then the street. Then the neighborhood. By sunset, he was parked at a truck stop outside Colorado Springs. The motel nearby wanted more money than he could justify spending. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow either. He reclined the seat as far as it would go. Boone curled up beside him. The cab smelled like dog fur, old coffee, and worn leather. Outside, diesel engines rumbled through the night. Headlights swept across the parking lot. Doug closed his eyes. For a while, nothing happened. Then a trailer hitch slammed somewhere nearby. Metal against metal. A sharp crack. Doug's eyes flew open. His body moved before his mind caught up. His hand shot toward a weapon that wasn't there. His breathing turned shallow. Every muscle tightened. The parking lot vanished. For half a second, he wasn't in Colorado. He was back in Iraq. Dust. Heat. Radio chatter. The sound of contact. The feeling that something terrible was about to happen. His heart hammered against his ribs. Then a wet nose touched his wrist. Doug blinked. The truck stop returned. The darkness. The windshield. The passing traffic. Boone had lifted his head. The dog's eyes never left him. Not alarmed, not confused. Just there. Doug slowly lowered his hand. "It's okay." His voice sounded rough. Boone moved closer, resting his head on Doug's knee. The pressure was steady, grounding, real. Doug stared through the windshield. Semi-trucks rolled in and out beneath yellow parking lot lights. Normal life. Other people's lives. Hours passed. Sleep came in pieces. 10 minutes here, 20 there. Every sudden sound pulled him halfway awake. At 2 a.m, he gave up trying. He sat in silence while Boone slept. Snow clouds drifted across the stars. The truck's clock glowed blue in the darkness. 2:17 a.m. 2:18. 2:19. The phone rang at 2:23. Doug frowned. Almost nobody called him anymore. He answered after the second ring. "Hello?" A man's voice came through the speaker. Professional. Careful. "Mr. Mercer?" "Yes. My name is Walter Green. I'm calling regarding the estate of your late cousin, Robert Mercer." Doug straightened slightly. Robert. He hadn't heard that name in months. "What about him?" There was a brief pause. Then the lawyer said something that would change everything. "Your cousin left something specifically for you." Doug looked down at Boone. The German shepherd had opened one eye, watching him. Outside, a cold wind rattled against the truck. "What did he leave?" The lawyer inhaled. "That's a longer conversation, Mr. Mercer." And suddenly, for the first time since leaving the house, Doug wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about what was waiting, somewhere, far away. Doug stayed awake for another hour after the call ended. The truck stop had grown quieter. A few diesel engines idled in the darkness. Yellow lights cast long shadows across rows of sleeping rigs. Beside him, Boone slept with one paw stretched across the center console. The dog twitched occasionally, chasing something in a dream. Doug stared through the windshield. Robert Mercer. His cousin had always been the strange one in the family. Quiet, private, never married, former Army engineer. Spent most of his life moving between government contracts and remote projects nobody seemed to understand. Family gatherings had never suited him. He'd show up late, leave early, speak only when necessary. The last time Doug had seen him was 3 years ago at a funeral. They had spent most of the afternoon sitting on a church bench, talking about weather and bad knees. Neither had mentioned loneliness. Men like them rarely did. The sky was beginning to lighten when Doug finally drifted asleep. Boone woke him 2 hours later by pressing a cold nose against his cheek. Yeah, Doug muttered. The German shepherd wagged his tail once. Breakfast came from a gas station counter. Coffee for Doug, 2 sausage patties for Boone. They sat on a concrete curb while the morning traffic rolled past. By 9 o'clock, Doug was parked outside a small law office in Colorado Springs. Walter Green turned out to be younger than Doug expected. Mid-50s, gray suit, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of man who organized his desk by exact measurements. Boone remained in the truck while Doug went inside. The office smelled faintly of paper and old wood polish. Walter opened a thick file folder. "Mr. Mercer, your cousin's estate was surprisingly simple." Doug nodded. Robert had never cared much about possessions. "No debts," Walter continued. "No surviving spouse. No children." Doug leaned back. "So what exactly did he leave?" Walter slid several papers across the desk. Doug looked down. A map, survey documents, property records, hundreds of acres. His brow furrowed. "This can't be right." "It is." Doug studied the map. Most of the land sat inside a remote section of northwestern Wyoming. Dense forest, mountain terrain, no towns nearby, no roads marked, nothing. "What am I looking at?" 342 acres. Doug blinked. 342 acres of what? Walter hesitated. Mostly wilderness. Doug almost laughed. Of course it was. Even dead, Robert managed to leave behind something complicated. There? A house? No. Cabin? Not according to county records. Water? A creek crosses the western section. Doug rubbed his jaw. So he left me 300 acres of trees. Walter cleared his throat. There is one other thing. He reached into the folder and produced an older document. The paper had yellowed with age. Handwritten notes filled the margins. Doug immediately noticed something strange. Contour markings. Grid references. Topographic symbols. Military-style notation, not civilian. His expression changed. Walter noticed. You recognize something? Doug nodded slowly. Maybe. The attorney turned the map around. We found this attached to the original deed. Doug examined it more closely. A narrow route had been marked in pencil. Several symbols had been circled. One area was heavily shaded, and at the bottom, written in Robert's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 words. Only approach from the North Ridge. Doug stared at the sentence. A memory surfaced. Iraq. A briefing tent outside Mosul. Engineers studying satellite imagery. Choosing safe approaches. Avoiding routes others expected. North Ridge. Not North Road. Not North Entrance. North Ridge. Specific. Intentional. Did Robert ever explain this place? Doug asked. Walter shook his head. No. He purchased the property decades ago and paid taxes every year. Never sold anything? No. Never developed it? No. Doug looked at the map again. Something felt wrong. Not dangerous. Just incomplete. Like a puzzle missing pieces. Walter folded his hands. To be completely honest, Mr. Mercer, most people would sell it. Doug smiled faintly. Most people. The lawyer smiled back. That's what I figured. An hour later, Doug was back in the truck. Boone immediately climbed into the passenger seat. Doug spread the map across the steering wheel. The dog watched him. Look at this. Boone tilted his head. Doug pointed toward the shaded section. Your guess is as good as mine. The dog licked his hand. Not helpful, but appreciated. The phone rang before he could start the engine. Ryan. Doug hesitated before answering. Hey. His son's voice came through the speaker. I heard about the land. Of course he had. News traveled fast in families, especially when money might be involved. It's just property. Ryan laughed. Dad, it's wilderness. Sell it. Doug looked down at the map. Maybe. Maybe not. You haven't even seen it. I don't need to. You're almost 70. You don't need 300 acres of forest. Doug watched a cloud drift across the windshield. Maybe I want to see it first. A pause, then another laugh, less friendly this time. Dad, don't be stubborn. Doug didn't respond. Ryan continued. Seriously, sell it before you get eaten by bears. The call ended a minute later. Doug sat quietly. Boone watched him, not judging, not advising, just there, the way he always was. An hour later, another call came. Linda. Doug almost ignored it. Almost. You heard? She asked. Apparently everyone has, Ryan told me. Doug nodded. Of course he had. Linda sighed. I just don't want you doing something irrational. Doug looked at the map again. The note, the markings, the route, the shaded section. Irrational like what? Driving into the middle of nowhere, chasing some fantasy. Doug stared through the windshield. For the first time in months, something had sparked inside him. Not hope exactly. Curiosity. Purpose. Movement. Small. Fragile. But there. I'm just going to look. You always were stubborn. He almost smiled. That's funny coming from you. Silence. Then the line disconnected. Doug folded the map carefully. Boone shifted in his seat. Outside, the mountains sat beneath a bright blue sky. Far away. Waiting. Doug started the engine. The old truck rumbled to life. Boone lifted his head. His ears perked forward, as if he already knew they were going somewhere important. Doug glanced one last time at the handwritten note. Only approach from the North Ridge. The words lingered in his mind long after the truck rolled onto the highway. Whatever Robert had left behind wasn't random. Doug was sure of that now. The only question was why. And somewhere beyond hundreds of miles of mountains, forests, and forgotten roads, the answer was waiting. Doug spent the next 3 days driving north, Colorado gave way to wide stretches of open country. Then Wyoming began to unfold around him. Huge skies, rolling grasslands, distant mountain ranges that looked blue in the afternoon light. The farther he drove, the quieter the world became. Boone seemed to notice it too. The German shepherd spent most of the trip sitting upright in the passenger seat, watching the landscape pass by. Every few hours, Doug stopped to fuel the truck. Every time Boone stepped out, he scanned the surroundings before doing anything else. Years in search and rescue had left habits behind. Doug understood that. Soldiers and working dogs weren't all that different. Neither ever completely forgot their training. Late on the fourth afternoon, cell service disappeared. The bars vanished from Doug's phone. A few miles later, the GPS froze. Then it lost signal completely. He wasn't surprised. The map Robert had left him hadn't mentioned roads. Only terrain, only directions. The North Ridge. By sunset, he reached a small mountain town that looked like it had been forgotten by time. One gas station, one diner, one hardware store. The mountains rose behind everything like silent walls. Doug parked outside the diner. Boone jumped down beside him. Inside, the smell of coffee and bacon filled the room. An elderly waitress poured coffee before he even asked. "Passing through?" she asked. "Something like that. You hunting?" Doug smiled. "No." She nodded toward the window. "Most folks who come this way are—" Doug looked outside. The mountains were already disappearing into darkness. "What lies north of here?" The waitress shrugged. "Trees." A few locals laughed quietly. One old rancher at the counter turned around. "Nothing worth seeing." Doug had heard that tone before, the tone people used when they knew more than they wanted to share. He finished his coffee and left. The temperature dropped fast after sunset. By the time he reached the dirt road marked on Robert's map, frost had already begun forming on the grass. The truck bounced over ruts and washouts. Branches scraped the sides. Boone remained alert, ears forward, eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. An hour later, Doug found a small clearing beside a creek. Good visibility, natural water source. Only one practical approach route. His military instincts approved immediately. He shut off the engine. Silence rushed in. Real silence. Not city silence. Not suburban silence. The kind of silence that existed before people arrived. The kind that made you aware of your own heartbeat. Doug stepped out. The air smelled of pine and cold earth. Above him, thousands of stars covered the sky. Boone moved around the perimeter while Doug unpacked camp. The dog checked every shadow, every tree line, every sound. By the time Doug finished setting up a small tent, Boone had completed 3 circuits of the clearing. Satisfied. Only then did he lie down. Doug cooked a simple meal over a camp stove. Nothing fancy, just enough. The fireless darkness beyond the clearing seemed endless. At one point, Boone lifted his head sharply. Doug followed the dog's gaze. Nothing, just trees. Yet Boone kept watching, listening. The dog finally relaxed 10 minutes later. Doug noticed. He always noticed. Old habits. Before sleeping, he unfolded Robert's map once more. The paper crackled softly. His flashlight beam swept across the markings. The shaded section remained several miles away. No roads, no structures, nothing obvious, just wilderness. But something about it bothered him. The terrain lines, the approach route, the note. Robert had been an engineer. Engineers didn't do things without reasons. Doug folded the map and slipped it into his jacket. The temperature dropped further. He climbed into his sleeping bag. Boone settled beside the tent entrance, always between Doug and whatever might come. The arrangement wasn't intentional anymore. It simply happened. Sometime after midnight, Doug woke suddenly. Not fully, just enough. Something had changed. Years of deployments had taught him to trust that feeling. His eyes opened. Darkness, cold, silence. Then, bang! The sound cracked through the mountains. Sharp, violent, close enough. Doug's body reacted instantly. Before conscious thought arrived, he was already moving, rolling from the sleeping bag, searching, orienting, finding cover. His heart slammed against his ribs. The darkness disappeared. For one terrible moment, another landscape took its place. Dust, heat, a convoy route outside Mosul, the radio screaming contact, the smell of burning rubber, someone shouting coordinates, another explosion. Doug's breathing shortened. His hands clenched. The past and present collided. Then something warm pressed against his shoulder. Boone. The dog stood beside him, motionless, calm, watching the tree line. Doug forced air into his lungs. One breath, then another. The mountains slowly returned, the creek, the tent, the stars, reality. Far away, another gunshot echoed. A hunter. Nothing more. Boone never barked, never panicked. The dog simply remained beside him until the shaking in Doug's hands faded. Eventually, Doug sat down on a fallen log. The night stretched around them. Boone climbed onto the ground beside him. Neither moved for a long time. Toward dawn, a pale, gray light touched the mountain peaks. Doug finally drifted into a shallow sleep. When he woke again, Boone was already standing, staring into the forest. The dog wasn't watching randomly. He was focused, locked onto something. Doug followed the line of Boone's gaze. Nothing. Just endless pine trees. Yet Boone continued staring. Minutes passed. The dog never looked away. Doug slowly stood. "See something, buddy?" Boone's ears twitched. His body remained rigid, watching, waiting, as though somewhere deep inside those woods, something had caught his attention. Something neither of them could see yet. Doug glanced toward the direction Boone had chosen, then back at the map. The shaded area lay somewhere beyond those trees, and for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, he felt certain of one thing. Boone sensed something ahead, something important. The German shepherd finally turned and looked at him, then looked back toward the forest, as if asking a question or offering an invitation. Doug followed Boone into the trees. The morning air carried the sharp scent of pine sap and damp earth. Frost still clung to patches of grass where sunlight hadn't reached yet. Somewhere high above, a hawk circled against a pale Wyoming sky. Boone moved ahead without hesitation, not running, not chasing. Purposeful. Every few yards he stopped, looked back, and waited, then continued. Doug noticed immediately that the dog wasn't wandering. He was following a route, the same way a trained search dog worked a scent trail, the same way soldiers moved toward a checkpoint when they already knew the destination. That thought stayed with him. For the next hour, they pushed deeper into the forest. The terrain grew steeper, the trees thicker. Doug checked the map twice, then 3 times. Nothing matched. No trail, no structure, no indication that anyone had ever built anything here. Yet Boone kept going. At one point, Doug crouched beside a patch of ground where the dog had paused. The soil looked different. Not natural, compacted, old. Almost as if heavy equipment had once crossed through decades earlier. Most people would have missed it. Doug didn't. Combat engineers learned to read terrain the way mechanics read engines. Every scar told a story. Every unnatural line meant something. He stood again. Boone was already moving. By noon, the dog had led him nearly 2 miles from camp. Doug stopped to drink water beside a fallen log. Boone ignored his own bowl. Instead, he stood facing a hillside covered with tall pines. Watching. Waiting. Doug followed his gaze. Nothing. Just trees. Then he noticed something strange. The spacing. Every pine stood almost the same distance apart. Not perfectly, but close enough. His eyes narrowed. Nature rarely worked that way. Foresters did. Developers did. Government crews did. Someone had planted these trees. Years ago. Maybe decades. The realization sent a small chill through him. He took a slow walk across the slope, studying, measuring with his eyes. The rows became more obvious the farther he looked. A pattern hidden inside chaos. Boone suddenly barked. One sharp sound. The first bark Doug had heard from him since arriving. Then the dog bounded forward. Doug followed. Branches scraped his jacket. Dead needles crunched beneath his boots. Boone stopped beside a cluster of brush and began pawing at the ground, not digging wildly. Scratching, testing, focused. Doug crouched beside him. "What'd you find?" The dog stepped aside. Doug brushed away leaves, then more leaves, then several inches of packed dirt. Something gray appeared beneath. His hand froze. Concrete. Old concrete. Weathered. Covered by years of forest growth, but unmistakably man-made. Doug cleared a larger section. The slab extended farther than he expected. Not a random foundation block. Degream 2020. Not debris. Part of something larger. Much larger. His pulse quickened. Boone watched closely, tail still, ears forward. Doug stood and slowly scanned the hillside. Suddenly, the forest looked different. The rows of trees, the hidden concrete, the unusual terrain, the north ridge. Pieces were beginning to connect, but not enough. Not yet. A cold breeze swept through the pines. Branches whispered overhead. Then Boone moved again. The dog headed uphill. Faster this time. Doug followed. The slope steepened. Several times he had to grab tree trunks for balance. His knee complained with every step. The old injury from a rock never missed an opportunity to remind him it existed. Halfway up the hill, Boone disappeared over a rise. Doug heard movement ahead. Then, silence. Too much silence. His instincts sharpened instantly. Years fell away. He slowed his pace. Watched the ground. Watched the tree line. Listening. Observing. The same way he'd moved through uncertain territory overseas. One careful step at a time. When he finally reached the top of the rise, Boone was standing motionless. The dog wasn't looking at Doug. He wasn't looking into the forest. He was staring at something hidden beneath a wall of brush. Doug approached slowly. Branches blocked most of the view. Thorn bushes tangled together. Dead limbs crisscrossed the opening. It looked untouched, until Boone pushed through. Doug followed, and stopped. For several seconds he couldn't speak, couldn't move. Hidden behind decades of growth stood something no map had shown. Something no county record had mentioned. A shape, a roofline, dark wood beneath tangled vines, partially buried by time, partially swallowed by the forest, but unmistakably human. A structure, large, silent, waiting. Boone stepped forward and looked back at him. The dog almost seemed proud, as if he had finally brought Doug exactly where he needed to be. Doug stared through the trees. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. The hidden shape stretched farther than he'd first realized. Too large for a hunting cabin, too well built for a storage shed, too deliberate to be forgotten by accident. And for the first time since Robert's lawyer had called, Doug understood one thing with absolute certainty. His cousin hadn't left him land. He had left him a secret. And whatever stood hidden beyond those pines had been waiting a very long time to be found. Doug remained frozen for several seconds. The forest seemed to fall silent around him. Even the wind felt distant. Boone stepped through the brush first. The German shepherd disappeared between tangled vines and young saplings that had grown unchecked for decades. Doug followed carefully. Every step revealed a little more. A wall, a window, a section of roof. Then the entire structure emerged from the wilderness. He stopped again. The building was much larger than he'd imagined. Not a cabin, not even close. The house stood nearly 2 stories tall. Weather-darkened timber walls rose from a stone foundation hidden beneath moss and roots. Pine branches draped over portions of the roof. Vines crawled across windows like fingers trying to pull the structure back into the earth. Yet somehow, it was still standing. Not collapsing. Not rotting away. Standing. Waiting. Doug slowly circled the front. The design wasn't decorative. It wasn't built to impress visitors. It looked practical, purposeful, almost military. The kind of place designed by engineers rather than architects. His pulse quickened. Boone was already inspecting the perimeter. The dog moved from window to window, sniffing, checking, working. Doug noticed something else. No access road. No driveway. No visible path. A structure this size shouldn't have existed without infrastructure. Yet the forest showed no obvious signs, as though someone had intentionally hidden it. The thought stayed with him. He climbed the sagging front steps. The boards creaked but held. One window near the entrance had been boarded from the inside. Another still contained old glass. Dust covered everything beyond it. No movement, no signs of recent life. Doug tried the front door. Locked. Not surprising. He moved around the side. A service entrance sat beneath an overhang. The handle resisted, then moved. The door opened inward with a groan. A smell drifted out. Dust. Old wood. Cold stone. Something else. Something familiar. Machine oil. Doug immediately noticed it. The scent didn't belong in a forgotten wilderness house. His instincts sharpened. Boone stood beside him, waiting. Doug removed a flashlight from his pack. The beam cut through darkness. The interior appeared frozen in time. Shelves lined the walls. A cast-iron stove occupied one corner. A long wooden table sat in the center of the room. Dust covered every surface. Yet nothing looked vandalized. Nothing appeared ransacked. It was as if whoever left had intended to return. Doug stepped carefully inside. Floorboards creaked beneath his boots. His flashlight swept across faded cabinets, storage lockers, metal filing drawers. A row of hooks mounted near the entrance. One still held an old canvas field jacket. The sight made him stop. Military surplus. 1950s era, maybe. Maybe older. He wasn't sure. But it didn't belong in an ordinary mountain retreat. Boone moved deeper into the house. His nails clicked softly against the floor. Doug followed. Room after room revealed more questions. A bunk room with 6 beds. A communications room containing old radio equipment. A workshop filled with rusted tools. Maps pinned to walls. Equipment racks. Everything coated in decades of dust. Everything strangely intact. The house felt less like a home and more like a facility. Outside, the afternoon light began fading. Doug checked his watch. Later than he'd realized. Too late to return to camp safely. He made a decision. They would spend the night here. An hour later, he had cleared enough space inside the main room for a temporary sleeping area. Boone remained restless. The dog kept patrolling, checking windows, listening. Twice, he paused near the back hallway. Both times, Doug noticed. Both times, Boone eventually moved on. The sun disappeared completely. Darkness settled over the mountains. The old house creaked occasionally as temperatures dropped. Doug heated a simple meal, then sat at the long table beneath a lantern. The silence felt different here. Heavy. Not threatening. Just watchful. As though the building itself remembered things. He unfolded Robert's map again. Now, the shaded section made more sense. This house had been the destination, but why hide it? Why keep paying taxes on land nobody visited? Why leave it to him? Boone suddenly raised his head. Doug looked up. The dog was staring toward the front wall, listening. A moment later, Doug heard it too. Crunch. A faint sound. Outside. Very faint. But there. He stood immediately. The old reflex returning. Lantern off. Flashlight ready. Movement controlled. Boone moved beside him without being asked. The house fell dark. Doug approached a side window. Carefully. Slowly. Not directly in front of it. Years of training remained buried in muscle memory. He glanced outside. Nothing. Only moonlit trees. Then he saw it. A disturbance in the dirt near the front clearing. Not movement. A track. Fresh. Far too fresh. His stomach tightened. The mark hadn't been there earlier. He was certain. Doug slipped outside with Boone beside him. Cold air hit his face. The forest remained quiet. He knelt near the disturbed ground. Moonlight revealed the shape clearly. A tire tread. Modern. Recently made. Doug followed it with his eyes. Another track. Then another. The marks disappeared into the darkness between the trees. Someone had been here. Recently. Not decades ago. Not years ago. Recently. His gaze moved toward the hidden forest beyond the house. A feeling settled in his chest. Not fear. Recognition. The same feeling he'd experienced countless times overseas, when evidence suggested he wasn't the only one watching an area. Someone else knew about the house. Someone else had found it. And judging by the freshness of the tracks, they might not be very far away. Behind him, Boone let out a low growl. The German shepherd stared into the darkness, toward the direction where the tracks vanished, toward someone or something they couldn't yet see. Doug remained crouched beside the tire marks for a long moment. The moonlight revealed enough. Deep tread. Modern. Not old ranch equipment. Not decades-old tracks preserved by chance. Fresh. Very fresh. Less than a day old. Maybe only hours. Boone stood beside him, muscles tight beneath his coat. The low growl never left the dog's throat. Doug slowly rose. His eyes followed the tracks into the darkness. Whoever had driven here knew exactly where they were going. That bothered him more than the tracks themselves. This place wasn't easy to find. He knew that now. The hidden house had been swallowed by forest for years, maybe decades. Yet someone had found it. The same way Robert had. The same way Boone had. Except unlike Boone, whoever left these tracks hadn't stumbled onto anything. They'd come here intentionally. Doug slept very little that night. The old bunk room felt safer than the tent, but not safe enough. Every creak of timber pulled him awake. Every gust of wind became footsteps. Twice, he got up to check the windows. 3 times, He walked the perimeter of the house with a flashlight. Boone followed every patrol, silent, watchful. Near dawn, Doug finally sat beside one of the dusty windows. The forest slowly brightened. Pine silhouettes emerged from darkness. Mist drifted between the trees. Boone rested beside him. The dog's eyes remained fixed on the woods. Neither trusted what they couldn't see. The next morning, Doug began working. Fear never solved problems. Information did. By noon, he had inspected most of the first floor. The structure continued to reveal pieces of a story. Storage lockers, old electrical systems, radio equipment, shelving built to military standards. Nothing decorative, everything functional. Then he found something that made him stop. A wall map. Faded, yellowed, still hanging inside what appeared to have been an operations room. Most of the markings had become difficult to read, but several symbols remained visible. Doug stepped closer. His heartbeat quickened. Grid references, observation points, communication relays. The language felt familiar. Not exactly military, but adjacent. Government work, engineering work, the kind of project that existed in shadows between agencies. He photographed everything with his phone, then moved on. The house continued to resist, giving up its secrets. Meanwhile, Boone kept doing something strange. Every 30 minutes or so, the dog disappeared. Not far, just long enough. He would leave one room, then return from another direction, always calm, always focused, almost as though he were searching for something. By late afternoon, Doug decided to examine the exterior more carefully. He followed the tire tracks. The marks led north for nearly half a mile before vanishing on rocky ground. No vehicle, no camp, nothing, only forest. That bothered him even more. On his way back, Boone suddenly veered off course. The dog pushed through a patch of brush and disappeared. Doug sighed. Boone. No response. A minute later, he heard scratching. Then another sound. A bark. Short. Sharp. Doug immediately changed direction. Branches caught his jacket as he moved downhill. The barking continued. Not alarmed, not aggressive, excited. When he finally reached Boone, the dog was standing inside the hidden house again, specifically inside the old communications room. His front paws rested against the floor, scratching. Doug stepped closer. What is it? Boone scratched again. The wooden floor responded with a dull, hollow sound. Doug froze, then scratched the surface himself. The difference was obvious. Most of the room rested on solid foundation. This section didn't. He knelt, pressed his ear against the floorboards, tapped once, then again. Hollow, definitely hollow. His engineer instincts immediately engaged. He began examining the room more carefully. Measurements. Set. Angles. Structural lines. Soon, another inconsistency appeared. The room dimensions didn't match the exterior footprint. The building should have contained more space than was visible. A hidden area, maybe beneath them, maybe behind them. Either way, Boone had found something. Again. The dog sat back and watched patiently, almost smug. Doug laughed for the first time in days. You know that? Boone tilted his head. Doug shook his own. Yeah, I think you do. For the next several hours, he searched. Eventually, he found it. A metal ring hidden beneath an old equipment cabinet, almost invisible beneath layers of dust. Doug cleared the area, wrapped his fingers around the ring, pulled. Nothing. Years of disuse had sealed it shut. He tried again, this time using a pry bar from the workshop. Metal groaned. Dust exploded upward. Then the section lifted. Cold air rushed from below. Doug's flashlight beam disappeared into darkness. Concrete stairs, leading down, much farther than he expected. Boone immediately stood, ears forward, eyes fixed on the opening. Doug stared into the darkness. A hidden basement didn't fit the house. Not one this deep. Not one built this deliberately. Something larger existed beneath the structure. Something Robert had never mentioned. Something nobody had recorded. The air rising from below smelled different. Dry. Cold. Mechanical. As though the darkness still remembered machines that had once operated there. Doug slowly swept his flashlight downward. The beam reached a landing nearly 20 feet below. Concrete walls. Steel doors. Government-grade construction. Not a cellar. Not storage. Something else entirely. Boone stepped to the edge. then looked back at Doug, waiting. The same look he'd given him beside the hidden house. The same look he'd given him in the forest. As if asking whether he was ready for the next piece of the story. Doug swallowed, because suddenly he understood something. The house had never been the secret. The house had only been hiding it. And whatever Robert had spent decades protecting was waiting beneath their feet. Doug stood at the top of the concrete stairs for nearly a minute. The flashlight beam disappeared into darkness below. Cold air drifted upward, not the stale smell of an abandoned basement, something different, dry, mechanical, almost preserved. Beside him, Boone remained perfectly still. The German shepherd's ears pointed forward. His eyes never left the opening. Doug had learned long ago to trust instincts, his own and Boone's. Both were telling him the same thing. Be careful. He grabbed an old lantern from the communications room, clipped it to his pack, and began the descent. The concrete steps stretched farther than expected. 10 feet, 15, 20. The temperature dropped noticeably. By the time they reached the bottom, Doug felt as though he had entered another world. The landing opened into a corridor reinforced with poured concrete walls. Steel conduit pipes ran overhead. Emergency lights hung from brackets along the ceiling. Most no longer worked. A few still contained faded bulbs. The hallway extended deeper underground. Boone moved ahead slowly, nose working, body low, focused. Doug swept the flashlight across the walls. Numbers appeared in faded black paint. Room designations. Storage. Communications. Operations. His pulse quickened. This wasn't a bunker built by hobbyists. This had required serious money, serious planning, and serious purpose. They reached the first steel door. Rust covered the hinges. The handle resisted, then gave way. The room beyond looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Metal desks, file cabinets, rotary telephones, stacks of paperwork sealed beneath decades of dust. Doug stepped inside. His flashlight illuminated a faded government emblem painted on one wall. Most of it had peeled away. Only fragments remained. Enough to suggest federal involvement, not enough to identify which agency. Boone wandered between desks, occasionally sniffing, occasionally pausing, always searching. Doug opened a filing cabinet. Most drawers contained nothing useful. Old maintenance records, supply inventories, weather logs. Then one drawer stuck halfway open. He pulled harder. The metal squealed. Inside sat several thick folders, all marked with the same designation, Mercer. Doug froze. For several seconds, he simply stared. Mercer. His own surname. Not Robert's first name. Not initials. Mercer. His fingers tightened around the folder. Slowly, he opened it. Inside were reports, engineering assessments, construction plans, progress updates. Every document listed the same lead engineer, Robert Mercer. Doug sat down heavily in the nearest chair. His cousin hadn't merely owned the property. He'd built it, or helped build it. Page after page confirmed it. Site evaluations, structural calculations, communications, infrastructure, emergency contingency plans. Robert's signature appeared everywhere, yet something felt wrong. Very wrong. Doug continued reading. Eventually he found it. A final report. Official. Stamped. Approved. The project summary listed every senior figure involved, every supervisor, every consultant, every department head, except Robert. His name was gone. Completely gone. Doug read the document twice. Then a third time, nothing. The man whose signature filled every working file had vanished from the final record, as though someone had erased him after the work was complete. The realization settled heavily inside him. He knew that feeling. The contact I found, and me, he understood it better than most. 37 years of sacrifice, years helping build a family, a home, a future. Then watching other people claim ownership of the story, watching your contribution disappear. Watching people act as though you had never mattered. Doug slowly closed the folder. Boone approached and rested his head against his knee. The simple gesture pulled him back to the present. Yeah, Doug said quietly. I see it too. The dog remained there, silent, steady. Outside the room, the corridor stretched deeper underground. The facility was much larger than this single office. Doug stood again. The next room contained communications equipment, rows of consoles, old radio systems, recording equipment, Some looked untouched. Others had been stripped of parts long ago. Farther down the hallway, they found an operations center. A massive wall map still dominated one side of the room. Colored pins remained fixed in place. Several regions across the western United States were marked. Wyoming, Montana, Colorado, Utah. Doug photographed everything. The deeper he explored, the stranger the facility became. This place had never been intended for public knowledge. Everything about it suggested secrecy, not danger, not conspiracy, simply secrecy. By the time they reached the final room, darkness had fully settled outside. The room appeared to be some sort of records archive. Most shelves stood empty. Boxes had been removed years ago. Only one metal cabinet remained. Unlike everything else underground, it was locked. Boone immediately approached it. The dog's tail stopped moving. He sniffed once, then twice, then sat directly in front of it. Doug smiled faintly. "You've picked up a habit." Boone ignored him. The cabinet sat against the far wall. Dust covered every surface, except one small section near the handle. Doug crouched. His smile disappeared. Someone had touched it. Recently, very recently, the dust had been disturbed. Not years ago, not months ago, days, maybe less. Doug slowly stood. The familiar feeling returned. The one he'd felt after finding the tire tracks. The one he'd felt watching dark roads overseas. The certainty that someone else had been here. Someone searching. Someone looking for exactly what he was looking for. Boone suddenly lifted his head. His ears locked forward. Doug heard it a second later. A faint sound, far above, outside the house. An engine, very distant, but unmistakable. A vehicle moving somewhere in the forest. The sound lasted only a few moments, then disappeared. Doug and Boone remained motionless, listening. The underground silence felt heavier than before, because now they both knew the truth. Whatever Robert had hidden down here wasn't forgotten. Someone else was still looking for it, and they were getting closer. Doug didn't sleep that night. He locked the steel cabinet room before heading back upstairs, though he knew the lock wouldn't stop anyone determined enough. The old house felt different now. Not abandoned. Occupied. Not by people. By questions. Boone settled near the front entrance, while Doug sat at the long wooden table with Robert's files spread before him. Outside, the forest remained silent. Too silent. Around midnight, Doug finally stood and checked every window again. The habit came naturally. Corners, sight lines, approach routes, potential cover. 30 years could pass, but some training never left. Boone followed him room to room. The dog's injured rear leg gave him a slight hitch in his stride, but his focus never wavered. Near 2 in the morning, Doug caught himself staring through a dusty window into the darkness. The trees looked harmless, peaceful even, but he'd learned long ago that danger rarely announced itself. Sometimes it simply waited. Morning arrived beneath a blanket of gray clouds. Doug made coffee on the old stove. Boone ate breakfast quickly, then returned to the communications room. The dog had become obsessed with the underground facility. Doug understood why. He felt the same pull. By late morning, he decided to return below. The locked cabinet still bothered him. Boone trotted ahead down the concrete stairs. The deeper they descended, the colder the air became. Doug reached the archive room and examined the cabinet carefully. Military-grade lock. Old. Heavy. He searched nearby shelves and drawers for almost an hour. Nothing. Then Boone suddenly froze. His head snapped toward the hallway. Doug saw it immediately. The dog wasn't curious. He was alert, listening. Doug held his breath. At first, he heard nothing. Then, a distant metallic sound. Faint. Very faint. Like a vehicle door closing somewhere outside. His stomach tightened. Someone was here. Again. Boone moved toward the corridor. Doug followed. They climbed back to ground level. The house stood silent. The forest stood silent. Yet Boone's posture had changed completely. Every muscle was tight, focused, ready. Doug stepped onto the porch. Fresh tracks crossed the muddy ground near the tree line. Not from yesterday. New. Minutes old. The realization hit hard. Whoever had been visiting the property wasn't merely exploring. They were watching. And now, they knew someone else had arrived. Doug followed the tracks carefully. Boone stayed close. The trail led north through the trees, not toward town, not toward the road. toward deeper wilderness. About a quarter-mile from the house, Doug spotted movement. Just a flash. A dark jacket disappearing behind trees. Then another figure. Two people. Not hunters. Not hikers. They moved differently. Fast. Purposeful. One glanced back. Their eyes met for only a second before the man disappeared downhill. Doug stopped. Instinct told him not to pursue. Too many unknowns. Too much terrain. One. Too much terrain. But Boone suddenly surged forward. The dog had seen them too. Boone! The command came sharp. Too late. The German shepherd sprinted through the trees. Doug cursed and followed. Branches whipped past. Loose rocks shifted beneath his boots. Ahead, Boone closed the distance rapidly. The figures broke into a run. One stumbled. The other shouted something Doug couldn't make out. Then everything happened at once. A loud crack echoed through the forest. Not an explosion. Not hunting season activity. Just a sharp report bouncing off the mountains. Birds erupted from nearby trees. Boone yelped. The sound froze Doug's blood. Boone! The dog disappeared behind a stand of pines. Doug pushed harder, ignoring the pain in his knee, ignoring the burning in his lungs. When he reached the clearing, the strangers were gone. Only silence remained, and Boone, the German shepherd, stood 20 yards away, breathing hard. One front leg lifted slightly off the ground. Doug rushed toward him. His heart hammered. The dog tried to wag his tail, then staggered. Doug dropped to one knee. His hands moved automatically. Training. Assessment. Find the injury. Control the damage. A line of blood stained Boone's shoulder. Not deep, but enough. The round, or a fragment of it, had grazed him while passing through brush. The wound looked ugly. The sight hit Doug harder than he expected. Harder than the divorce. Harder than sleeping in his truck. Harder than seeing his life packed into 3 suitcases. Boone had chosen him. Every day. Without conditions. Without disappointment. Without judgment. Quote, and now he was bleeding because he'd tried to protect him. Doug swallowed hard. Hey. His voice cracked. The dog pressed closer, still worried more about Doug than himself. The nearest veterinary clinic was hours away. Doug cleaned the wound with supplies from his truck. Carefully. Methodically. The same way he'd treated injuries in far worse places years ago. Boone never complained, never pulled away. By sunset, the dog lay beside the stove wrapped in blankets, occasionally shivering, occasionally sleeping. Doug sat beside him, watching, waiting. Night settled over the hidden house once again. The wind pushed against the walls. Branches scraped the roof. The old building creaked softly. Doug didn't move. Hours passed. Boone finally opened his eyes near midnight. The dog looked tired, but alert. Alive. Doug exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. Then Boone did something unexpected. He struggled to his feet. Doug immediately tried to stop him, but Boone ignored him. The dog limped toward the communications room, then toward the hidden staircase, then stopped at the top, waiting, looking back, insisting. Doug frowned. Not tonight. Boone didn't move. The dog simply stared at him, then toward the underground facility, then back again, as if he was trying to say one thing. The answer wasn't in the forest. It was still hidden below, and somehow, despite the pain in his shoulder, Boone seemed more determined than ever to find it. Doug stared at the dog. Boone stood at the top of the basement stairs, favoring his injured shoulder but refusing to lie back down. The bandage was already spotted with faint traces of blood. Any sensible animal would have rested. Boone wasn't interested in being sensible. The German shepherd looked from Doug to the darkness below, then back again, waiting. Doug sighed. You never quit, do you? Boone's ears twitched. That was answer enough. An hour later, Doug found himself descending the concrete stairs once again. The underground facility felt different at night, more isolated, more detached from the world above. The silence seemed thicker. The beam of his flashlight cut through darkness while Boone limped carefully beside him. Doug hated bringing the dog down here injured, but Boone clearly believed something remained undiscovered. And after everything that had happened, Doug trusted Boone more than he trusted his own instincts. They returned to the archive room. The locked cabinet remained untouched. The disturbed dust around it remained visible beneath the flashlight. Whoever had been here before hadn't managed to open it. Or perhaps they hadn't had time. Doug examined the cabinet again. Military-grade steel. Heavy hinges. No obvious weakness. His eyes drifted to the surrounding wall, then paused. Something wasn't right. The cabinet sat several inches farther forward than it should, almost as if it had been positioned to cover something. His pulse quickened. Slowly, he pushed. Nothing. The cabinet didn't move. Then Boone stood. The dog approached the side panel and began sniffing along the edge. Not the lock, not the handle, the wall itself. Doug crouched beside him. "What is it?" Boone pressed his nose into a narrow gap where steel met concrete. Doug shined the flashlight closer. A hairline seam became visible, almost invisible, deliberately hidden. He traced it with his fingers. The seam extended downward, then sideways. Not a wall, a concealed panel. For several minutes he searched. Eventually his fingers found a recessed latch. His heart hammered. One pull. Nothing happened. A second pull. Still nothing. Then, a sharp metallic click echoed through the room. The hidden section shifted slightly. Dust fell from above. Boone immediately stepped back. Doug pulled harder. The concealed panel swung inward. Cold air spilled out. A narrow compartment revealed itself beyond. No larger than a walk-in closet. No shelves. No furniture. Just a single steel storage chest. Waiting. Doug stood motionless. After all the hidden rooms, the secret maps, the underground facility, the visitors, everything seemed to lead here. Boone sat beside him, watching quietly. Doug approached the chest. Unlike the cabinet, it wasn't locked. His hand hesitated over the lid. Then he opened it. Inside sat several thick journals, a bundle of letters tied together with faded cord, rolled blueprints, photographs, and a sealed envelope. The name written across the front stopped him cold. Douglas Mercer. No, if found. No date, no instructions, simply his name, written in Robert's handwriting. Doug lowered himself onto the floor. The underground room suddenly felt very small, very quiet. For several moments, he simply stared at the envelope. Then he reached for the journals first. Something told him to understand the story before reading the letter. The first journal began in 1979, the second in 1983, the third in 1987. Hour after hour passed. Doug barely noticed. The entries painted a picture that no official file had captured. Robert had been far more than an engineer. He had designed major portions of the underground facility, communication systems, structural redundancies, emergency infrastructure. The project had been his life. Then came the betrayal, a supervisor, a political appointment, someone with connections. The journals never described the man with hatred, only disappointment. The final reports had been rewritten, credits reassigned, achievements redistributed. The facility remained. The recognition vanished. Robert's name disappeared from the official history. Doug stared at a photograph showing a much younger Robert standing beside the completed command center. Proud, confident, alive. No plaque would ever carry his name. No public record acknowledged what he'd built. The realization hit Doug harder than expected. Not because of Robert, because of himself. He remembered drafting construction estimates late at night for Linda's business ideas, working overtime for years, missing birthdays, missing holidays, building a life for other people, then watching it all become someone else's story, watching himself slowly disappear from the narrative. His throat tightened. Boone rested his head on his leg. The dog had moved closer without him noticing. Doug scratched behind Boone's ears absent-mindedly, then finally reached for the envelope. The paper felt fragile. He opened it carefully. The letter inside contained only a few pages. Yet by the end of the first paragraph, Doug's vision blurred. Robert had known. Not about the divorce, not about the house, about something deeper, about what happened to men after decades of giving pieces of themselves away, about becoming invisible, about wondering whether any of it had mattered. Doug continued reading. The underground room faded around him. Only Robert's words remained. Each sentence felt less like a letter and more like a conversation that should have happened years earlier. A conversation between two men who understood the same loneliness, the same silence, the same weight. By the time he reached the final page, he was no longer reading quickly. He was reading slowly, carefully, because he knew he would remember these words for the rest of his life. The final paragraph began with a single sentence. A sentence that made Doug close his eyes. Because for the first time since losing everything, someone had put into words exactly what he had never been able to say himself. If you're reading this, Robert had written, then someone probably convinced you that your best years are behind you. Doug sat motionless. The concrete walls around him seemed to disappear. Only the letter remained. Only Robert's voice. The words felt strangely alive, as if his cousin were sitting across from him in that underground room, as if decades had collapsed into a single conversation. Boone lay beside his chair. The dog's breathing had finally become steady. The bandage around his shoulder looked cleaner now. Less blood. More healing. Doug rested one hand on Boone's back while continuing to read. They'll tell you your usefulness ended when your career ended, when your marriage ended, when your body stopped cooperating. Don't believe them. Doug swallowed. The words landed harder than he expected, because that was exactly what the last year had felt like. A slow erasing. First the retirement, then the distance from his children, then the divorce, then the house. Each loss had removed another piece, until eventually he'd begun wondering whether anything remained. The next page revealed why Robert had left him the property. Not because of money, not because of family obligation, not even because of the facility itself. Robert had chosen Doug because he believed Doug would understand. The journals explained everything. Years earlier, Robert had attempted to restore his place in the project's history. Official requests, documentation, evidence, witness statements. Every effort failed. The agencies involved acknowledged his work privately, never publicly. Someone higher up had already received the credit. Changing the story would embarrass too many important people. So the story remained unchanged. History moved on. Robert became a footnote. Doug stared at a photograph clipped to one page. A younger Robert stood beside several engineers. Everyone else's names appeared on a printed plaque beneath the image. Robert's did not. Someone had crossed his face with a pen. Not maliciously, almost carelessly, as though removing him required no effort at all. Doug looked away. The image hurt, because he recognized it. Different circumstances, same wound. He thought about sitting alone in the truck stop parking lot. 3 suitcases, a sleeping dog, no home, no purpose, no direction. He thought about Ryan's voice. Sell the land, Dad. He thought about Linda, about 37 years becoming paperwork, about being reduced to what remained after everyone else had chosen sides. The underground room blurred. Doug realized his eyes had filled with tears. He hadn't cried when he lost the house, hadn't cried during the divorce hearing, hadn't cried sleeping in the truck. But here, surrounded by another man's forgotten life, something finally broke loose. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. The way ice cracks beneath sunlight. Boone lifted his head immediately. The German shepherd rested his muzzle on Doug's knee. Doug laughed once through the tears. You always know. The dog thumped his tail softly. The final pages of the letter contained instructions. Not legal instructions. Personal ones. Robert had anticipated exactly what would happen. People would eventually discover the facility. Historians, researchers, government archivists, collectors, maybe journalists. The story wouldn't stay hidden forever. And when that happened, Robert wanted one thing: the truth preserved. Not for himself, for everyone erased beside him, the names that never appeared. The engineers, operators, builders, workers, people who spent years creating something important and vanished from the official narrative. The last paragraph ended with a sentence. Doug read 3 times. What matters isn't who gets remembered first. What matters is making sure the truth survives long enough to be found. Silence settled over the room, deep silence, the kind that follows something important. Doug carefully folded the letter, then sat staring at the steel chest. For the first time since arriving in Wyoming, the mystery no longer felt like treasure. It felt like responsibility. Hours passed. Near dawn, Doug climbed back upstairs. The eastern horizon glowed faintly beyond the trees. Morning fog drifted through the forest. The hidden house stood quiet beneath pale light. Boone followed him outside. The dog moved slowly but stubbornly. Doug sat on the porch steps. The cold air felt clean, different, lighter somehow. For the first time in months, the noise inside his head had eased. Not disappeared, just softened. Then his phone vibrated. 1 bar of signal had somehow appeared. A voicemail notification. 3 missed calls, 2 from unknown numbers. One from Ryan. Doug listened. His son's voice sounded strangely different, less confident, more urgent. Dad, call me back. A pause. Then another voice entered the message. Linda's. We need to talk. Doug frowned. That alone was unusual. The next voicemail explained why. Someone had leaked information about the underground facility. Not everything, just enough. Enough for local historical groups to start asking questions. Enough for reporters to begin making calls. Enough for people to realize the hidden property might be worth far more than anyone had imagined. Doug slowly lowered the phone. The morning suddenly felt less peaceful, because he knew exactly how the world worked. When something looked worthless, nobody cared. When it became valuable, everyone appeared. Boone stared toward the tree line, watching, listening. Doug followed the dog's gaze. The forest remained still, yet a feeling settled in his chest. The same feeling he'd had when discovering the tire tracks. The same feeling he'd felt before contact in unfamiliar territory. The story hidden beneath the house was no longer sleeping. People were waking up to it, and some of those people were already on their way. The first vehicle arrived 3 days later. Not the mysterious pickup Doug had seen in the forest. A silver SUV. Clean. Expensive. Completely out of place on the rough mountain road. Doug spotted it from the porch before it reached the clearing. Old habits. Observe first. Move second. Boone stood beside him. The German Shepherd's shoulder was healing, but a thin scar had begun forming beneath the fur. The dog watched the approaching vehicle without making a sound. The SUV stopped. A woman stepped out holding a notebook. Then a camera. Reporter. Doug had expected that. What he hadn't expected was what came next. By the end of the week, 4 more vehicles arrived. A historian from Cheyenne, a military archivist from Denver, 2 researchers studying Cold War infrastructure. Everyone wanted the same thing. The story, the hidden facility, Robert Mercer. Doug spent hours answering questions, showing documents, sharing photographs, listening as experts confirmed what he had slowly begun to realize. Robert's work had been extraordinary. The facility represented a significant engineering achievement, and his name had been removed from history. One historian shook his head while reviewing the journals. This should have been credited decades ago. Doug looked toward the forest. Yeah, the man studied him for a moment. You sound like you've heard that before. Doug didn't answer. He didn't need to. The following Monday brought another visitor. This one hurt. Ryan. Doug saw his son's truck climbing the road shortly after noon. For a moment, he simply stared. Boone noticed immediately. The dog rose from beneath the porch swing. His tail moved once, then stopped. Neither seemed sure what to expect. Ryan climbed out slowly. The confidence Doug remembered was gone. He looked uncomfortable, like someone entering a house where he no longer belonged. Dad. Doug nodded. Ryan. The silence stretched, long enough for old memories to fill it. Baseball games, fishing trips, teaching a teenager how to drive. Then, years of distance, years of excuses, years of choosing easier loyalties. Ryan looked toward the hidden house, toward the journalists, toward the people walking around taking photographs. This place is kind of incredible. Doug almost smiled. Kind of. There it was. The first step. Not an apology. Not yet. An observation. Ryan shifted his weight. I've been seeing articles. I'm aware. They say the property could be worth a lot. Doug looked at him carefully. There it was. The second step. Money. Always money. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Most of it awkward. Some of it painful. Ryan suggested investors. Partnerships. Development opportunities. Heritage tourism. A foundation. A sale. Doug listened quietly, then shook his head. No. Ryan frowned. No, I'm not selling it. Dad, do you realize what this could be worth? Doug looked across the clearing. Boone was lying beneath a pine tree watching both men. The dog seemed calmer than either of them. Yeah, Ryan laughed nervously. You could retire comfortably. I already retired. Dad, be serious. Doug met his son's eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to convince him of anything. Not his value, not his choices, not his pain, nothing. The freedom surprised him. I'm keeping it. Ryan looked disappointed, not angry, just disappointed. The same expression Doug had worn after too many conversations over the years. Eventually, Ryan left. The truck disappeared down the mountain road. Doug watched it go. Boone walked over and sat beside him. Neither moved for several minutes. 2 days later, Linda called. Doug almost didn't answer. Almost. Her voice sounded careful, practiced, as if she'd rehearsed the conversation. I heard things are going well. Doug looked out the window. The hidden house glowed gold beneath the afternoon sun. Depends how you define well. A pause, then another. I was thinking, maybe we should meet. Doug closed his eyes briefly. Not from anger, from recognition. The timing said everything. The divorce had happened when the property was worthless. The call arrived when people started assigning value to it. Funny how that worked. No. Silence. Then surprise. What do you mean no? I mean no. Linda wasn't used to hearing that word from him. Not from Doug. Not from the man who had spent decades compromising, accommodating, giving. I thought maybe we could talk. We're talking. You know what I mean. Doug looked toward the old underground facility hidden beneath the house, toward Robert's journals, toward Boone sleeping in a patch of sunlight. No, Linda, I don't. The conversation ended shortly afterward. When he hung up, something unexpected happened. Nothing. No anger, no regret, no satisfaction, nothing. The emotional weight she'd carried for years simply wasn't there anymore. The realization felt strange and liberating. The following week brought another wave of attention. Veterans organizations reached out. Historical societies offered support. Archivists volunteered expertise. The story continued spreading. Yet none of it affected Doug the way people expected. The attention wasn't the reward. The truth was, one evening, while sorting documents, he found Boone standing near the old communications room window, watching the sunset. The dog still carried his scar, a permanent reminder. Doug crouched beside him. You know something? Boone glanced at him. A warm breeze drifted through the open window. The mountains beyond glowed orange. I think we found what Robert wanted us to find. Boone rested his head against Doug's shoulder. Outside, the forest stood peaceful. Inside, the hidden house no longer felt abandoned. It felt alive. And for the first time since standing beside 3 suitcases on a Colorado sidewalk, Doug knew exactly what he was going to do next. A decision that would surprise everyone, including the people who suddenly wanted back into his life. The announcement happened on a cold morning in early spring. Snow still clung to the shadows beneath the pines. The mountains beyond the property remained capped in white. Doug stood on the porch of the hidden house while a handful of reporters, historians, veterans, and local residents gathered in the clearing. Boone sat beside him. The German shepherd's scar had healed, a thin silver line beneath his fur, a permanent reminder of what they had survived together. The crowd expected a sale, some expected a partnership, others expected a museum. Everyone expected money to be involved. Doug looked across the faces, waiting for an answer. Then he unfolded a single piece of paper. His hands were steady. Years ago, they wouldn't have been. Years ago, he would have worried about disappointing people. Not anymore. The property isn't for sale. A murmur passed through the crowd. Exactly as he expected. Doug continued. The underground facility will be preserved. Several historians immediately smiled, but he wasn't finished. The house will become a support center for homeless veterans and veterans struggling to rebuild their lives. Silence followed. Then surprise. Real surprise. Not the polite kind. The genuine kind. Doug looked toward the forest, toward the hidden road Boone had discovered months earlier, toward the place where his own life had changed. When I arrived here, he said, I didn't have much left. No one interrupted. No one looked away. I had an old truck, 3 suitcases, a dog, and a lot of reasons to believe my best years were behind me. Several veterans in the crowd lowered their eyes. They understood, more than most. The project grew faster than Doug imagined. A veterans organization offered grants. Historians volunteered expertise. Local contractors donated labor. Retired military engineers offered to help restore portions of the facility. Within a year, the hidden property looked different. Not transformed, revived. The old house remained itself. The same timber walls, the same porch, the same mountain view. But now lights glowed in the windows. Voices echoed through hallways. Laughter occasionally drifted across the clearing. Life had returned. The underground facility became a small historical archive. Robert's journals were preserved, his contributions documented, his name finally attached to the project he helped create. A bronze plaque appeared near the entrance. Simple, modest, accurate. Exactly the way Robert would have wanted it. Visitors came from across the country. Some arrived to study history. Others arrived carrying burdens far heavier than backpacks. Former soldiers, former Marines, former airmen. People who had spent years feeling disconnected from the lives they'd once known. Doug recognized the look immediately. He had worn it himself. The center offered practical support, temporary housing, job assistance, peer counseling. But more importantly, it offered something harder to describe. A place where nobody had to explain every scar. A place where silence was understood. Boone became famous without understanding why. Visitors loved him. Veterans trusted him. The German shepherd seemed able to identify the people who needed him most. More than once, Doug watched Boone quietly sit beside a man who hadn't spoken all day. Sometimes the dog would remain there for hours. No commands, no training, just presence. The kind that couldn't be taught. The kind that saved people. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after arriving in Wyoming, a familiar vehicle climbed the mountain road. Doug recognized it immediately. Take 7. Take Emily. His daughter stepped out holding a cardboard box. For several seconds, neither moved. Then she walked forward. Older, a little tired, a little uncertain. Much like him. I brought something. Doug looked inside the box. Photographs. Family albums. Old military pictures. Letters. Pieces of a life he'd thought were gone forever. Emily's eyes filled slightly. I should have come sooner. Doug nodded. The mountain breeze moved gently through the trees. You came. That was enough. They spent the afternoon talking on the porch, not fixing everything, not pretending nothing had happened, simply talking, the way people do when they finally stop defending old mistakes. Ryan never fully returned. A birthday card arrived each year, sometimes a short phone call, sometimes nothing. Doug learned to accept that too. Not every wound closed, some simply stopped bleeding, and that was enough. One evening during the first snowfall of winter, Doug stepped onto the porch alone. The property was quiet. Most visitors had gone inside. The mountains glowed silver beneath moonlight. Fresh snow covered the clearing. Boone followed him outside. The dog moved more slowly now. Age was beginning to catch him, but he still carried himself with quiet dignity. Doug sat on the porch steps. Boone settled beside him. The German shepherd rested against his leg, just like he had in the truck stop parking lot all those months ago. Just like he had after nightmares, after discoveries, after gunfire, after loss. Far below the hill, small lights illuminated the veterans' memorial they had built near the archive. Flags moved gently in the wind. The sound reached them a moment later, soft, peaceful. Doug listened. No highway traffic, no diesel engines, no sudden metallic crashes that pulled him back into old memories. The flashbacks still came occasionally. Some scars remained, but they no longer controlled the map of his life. For years, he had believed he was trying to find his way back. Back to the marriage, back to the family, back to the man he used to be. The hidden house had taught him something different. Sometimes there was no going back. Sometimes the road only moved forward, toward something new, toward something waiting, toward a life you couldn't see yet. Doug looked at Boone. The dog opened one eye, then closed it again. Satisfied, the old soldier smiled. Snow drifted quietly through the mountain air. The forest stood watch around the hidden house. The same forest that had concealed it for decades. The same forest Boone had led him through. The same forest that had given him back something he thought was gone forever. Not money, not status, not revenge. Purpose. Home. And for the first time, in a very long time, Douglas Mercer no longer felt like he was searching for the way home, because he was already there. If this story touched your heart, leave a simple 1 in the comments below. And if you've ever had to start over in life, no matter your age, leave a 2 so others know they're not alone. I read your comments every day, and I'd love to know where you're watching from. And if you enjoyed this journey with Doug and Boone, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. There are many more powerful stories ahead. Stories about loyalty, second chances, courage, and the people who refuse to give up when life knocks them down. Your next unforgettable story is waiting. We'll see you in the next one.